I'm Brian Epstein, and the title of my talk is Ontological Explanation Without Reduction. So, when I think about what we're trying to do in social ontology, it seems to me that a fundamental task is to answer questions of the form, what is it? What is F? Or what are Fs? What are social groups? What are group agents? What is money? What is law? These kinds of questions. That's kind of one of the main tasks that we're doing in social ontology. In metaphysics more generally, there have been some recent attempts to unify the way that we think about and answer these questions. People have, over the last 25 years or so, been working on new approaches to essence and necessity. In the last several years, they've been working on grounding. And now some people have started talking about what they're calling real definition, a kind of metaphysical reduction. And there's some new work on somewhat obscure topics like generic identity or formulations of the form to be F is to be G, how we're to understand these things. And a number of people in the literature and metaphysics have been trying to unify all of these different sorts of notions with one another. Gideon Rosen has an article on real definition from 2015, as does Kit Fine. Fabrice Correa has done a number of different parts of this sort of project, as have Correa and Alex Giles. Augustine Rayo and Kian Dor are also working on these sorts of topics. And that's the literature that I want to discuss today. I think that these people are right, that these notions that they're discussing and what is it questions in metaphysics do need to be sorted out. There's a lot of work that we need to do in order to make progress on them. But I'm inclined to think that some of the unifying moves that they've made have actually taken a wrong turn. And this is one area, what I want to do today is kind of a small part of this project. It's a little bit of a negative argument that I want to make today. But the way that I think about it is that it's part of a larger project that I've been interested in a long time which is to kind of find ways where good work in social ontology can help inform metaphysics, in addition to just taking lessons from metaphysics and applying them to social ontology. So today's agenda is to talk about real definition, talk about how it's being used in the literature, and then give a very quick overview of a recent approach to it. And then I want to give a counterexample to the overall thrust of the unification work, as I'll discuss in this literature. I'm going to argue in favor of real definitions as being more heterogeneous rather than reductive, as these people are starting to be inclined to endorse. Okay, so let me start with a nice explanation or introduction to real definition given by Gideon Rosen in his 2015 paper. And this is how he explains real definition. He says, the old Socratic questions, what is justice, what is courage, call for definitions, not of words or of concepts, but of things. To answer the question, what is courage in the intended sense, is not to say what the English word courage means. Or what passes before the mind when we think of courage. It is to say what it is for a person to be courageous, to identify that in which the courage of the courageous person consists, by specifying non-trivial, necessary and sufficient conditions for courage somehow grounded in the nature of courage itself. And then he goes on and he mentions a bunch of other examples. When we ask what it is for a thing to be a person, or for a creature to be conscious, or for a fact to be a law of nature, or for two expressions to be synonymous, or for an object to be colored, or for an action to be free, or for an artifact to be an artwork, we're best understood as seeking real definitions of the properties, kinds, and relations that figure into our questions, rather than the semantic or conceptual equivalents. So there's a lot in this that I agree with, a little bit that I disagree. I agree that real definitions of F are the kind of, what we mean by that is to give a full explanation of the nature of F, answering the question, what is F? I also agree that this is a metaphysical question we're asking rather than a semantic or a conceptual question. The thing that I want to take issue with is what's implicit in the second part of the first paragraph, where he says to answer what is F, like what is courageous, is to say what it is for X to be F. What is courage is to say what it is for X to be courageous. And that, I think, is kind of the misstep that I want to focus on today. Now, a lot of this literature takes more or less the same approach with respect to this particular point. They differ in a lot of other ways, but in this point they all seem to agree. Kit Fine, for instance, has an analysis, which I think a number of people have taken up, of real definition, where he basically wants to suggest that real definition provides constitutively necessary and sufficient conditions, in a sense. They're constitutively necessary conditions, and the way he interprets that is that it provides those conditions that are essential to X being F, and constitutively sufficient conditions, those that ground X being F. So he sees essence and ground in some ways as being sort of converses, complementary to one another in providing real definitions. And then he develops, and this is kind of the important technical move that he makes, he develops what he calls a generic treatment of essence. Instead of thinking about essence as being something that ranges over all objects quantificationally, what he does is he says, let's take some object X that's F, and then we see, well, what is essential to any object being F. He's not saying for all objects quantificationally, he just says to say that to be F is to be G is to say, in first, that it is essential to X as being F, that X is G. It's essential to X having the property F, that X has the property G. And then he reverses it for, he adds this in the other direction, a kind of grounding understanding. So he also has a generic understanding of, in this recent paper, of how to understand grounding claims. That when we say an object X is F, well, we can say that that's grounded by X being G. An object X is F in virtue of that object being G. If we can do this in both directions, then we have a reductive real definition. We can give, in some sense, constitutively necessary conditions for X to be F, and we can give constitutively sufficient conditions for X to be F. So there's a lot of detail in his analysis, but this is all that really matters in terms of the claim that I want to be worrying about. So Fine goes on a little bit and gives some explanation of how to interpret these generic statements of essence and ground. And his basic idea is this. He says, to give the nature of F is to give the conditions that an object needs to satisfy in order to have F. In order to give the nature of courage, it's to give the conditions an object needs to satisfy in order to be courageous. That's very much like what Rosen said. And then he adds this arbitrary objects interpretation. He says, how are we to understand what we mean an object needs to satisfy? He says, take an arbitrary object, and to explain what it is for that object to have F is that it satisfy these conditions. So he's kind of interpreting this the way that we do analysis as involving picking an arbitrary object and then trying to cash out what it would take for that arbitrary object to then have the property F. Okay, other approaches in the literature like Gideon Rosen's, Kian-Dor's, Correa, and Skiles take a similar perspective with respect to this point. Now, what I want to do here is immediately move to a counterexample. Moving relatively quickly because there's not a lot of time. So the counterexample I want to give is something that I've just kind of taken from some earlier work that I had done on social groups. So I have a paper on the metaphysics of social groups. Similar kinds of examples also come out of other sorts of social entities. So there's some examples in the 2015 book that would work as well. But the example that I want to talk about is just an example of a particular kind of social group, which is a Tufts faculty committee, chosen fairly arbitrarily. So one of the things that this paper on the nature of social groups discusses is various kinds of conditions that need to be satisfied in order for various facts to obtain about the groups. Now, that's a different thing from saying the conditions that need to be satisfied in order for some object to be a group of that kind, as I'll explain. What I'm doing is, in this paper, is to explain the conditions for various kinds of facts to obtain. One fact, for instance, is that a particular Tufts faculty committee comes to exist. There are certain conditions that need to be satisfied in order for a faculty committee to come to exist. There's other conditions that need to be satisfied in order for a faculty committee that exists at some time to then go on and exist at a later time as well. So consider, for instance, the coming to exist conditions. Here's the sort of thing that needs to happen in order for a Tufts faculty committee to come to exist, and it's written on the slide. A new Tufts faculty committee comes to exist at time t0 in world W if and only if some appropriate process of voting has taken place and set up by the faculty has taken place leading up to t0. Obviously, I'm not going to specify exactly what that process is, but it's a Tufts-specific process. And if that process is followed, then a new faculty committee has come to exist. Okay. Then the persistence condition is, well, it's continuing to exist. So if we take some Tufts faculty committee at time t, then if the members have gone through some appropriate process of rotations and nominations and whatever it takes for faculty committees to change, then that's necessary and sufficient. If it's taken place in that interval from t to t prime, then it is sufficient for it to exist at that subsequent time t prime. Okay, so that is the kind of basic analysis of one of the components of what it is to be a Tufts faculty committee. There are other components that I discuss in that paper, but this is just the ones that will provide the counterexample. The problem is this: even what I've said so far cannot be captured by an analysis of the conditions on what it is for X to be a Tufts faculty committee. Why? Well, here's what that analysis will give you. It says, okay, let's take some arbitrary object X, and for X to be a Tufts faculty committee at T is for X to have satisfied some property, say property G. Okay, and in this case, maybe it had to satisfy the coming to exist conditions at some time t0 before t, and then it has to persist from t0 to t. Okay, that much will be given by the Rosen, Fine, Dorr, Correa, Skiles type of analysis. It'll tell you, well, these are the conditions that some object needs to satisfy if it is to be a Tufts faculty committee. However, the conditions that I gave in the previous slide say more. That only captures part of what the coming to exist conditions assert. The points on the last slide don't just talk about the conditions for a given object to be a committee, that is, for a committee to come to exist. They also say something about the other direction. They say that if you've gone through this process, whatever that faculty process is, then that necessitates that a new faculty committee has come to exist. So this is missed in an analysis of what it is for something to be a Tufts faculty, for X to be a Tufts faculty committee. Now, that went very quickly, so let me give you another example to try to illustrate what I mean by this. Here's a more general example. Suppose that you have some social object of some given kind, and the way that those things get generated is if you have some kind of speech act that gets performed to generate them. Maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's a graduation, maybe it is becoming a president or a judge or a professor. Some sort of declarative speech act is part, maybe we'll call it even the complete thing, that needs to be done in order for that social kind to be instantiated. It's not enough to say, okay, let's take some arbitrary object. For that object to be a member of K, it has to have been generated by that sort of speech act. That's true, but we also need the converse, which is whenever the speech act is performed under the appropriate conditions, an object of that kind K is generated. Both of these are part of the real definition, or ought to be part of the real definition of K. But a full analysis of for X to be F is for X to be G is not enough to capture the nature of F. Okay, this point doesn't just hold for social groups, it doesn't just hold for these examples, it holds for most social kinds and most kinds of groups. Okay, so what's the problem? What's going on here? I think that what's happened is that current approaches to real definition are taking a kind of an uncritically taking on what the traditional job of philosophical analysis has been. That is, to give necessary and sufficient conditions, instantiation conditions for some sort of predicate. And that is kind of what the project of philosophical reduction has been trying to do. But I think that this is not right. Things and kinds have more heterogeneous essences than can be captured by these kinds of unified analyses. So what I want to propose is that we can do these projects in answering what is F questions. The project of social ontology is indeed in large part to give real definitions, to answer questions: what are social kinds? What are the kinds of things that we're trying to give analyses of? But it's not adequate to merely to give this kind of generic, object bearing a property kind of analysis, predicative analysis, that seems to be the growing consensus in the metaphysics community. This was actually one of the reasons that I introduced the idea of frame principles in my book and in a number of other articles. And I suggested at the time that these different principles can't be aggregated into a single bidirectional statement. Now, I don't think that that analysis from several years ago was perfect, and this literature actually I think has a lot to contribute. So I think it's a very useful literature to pay attention to, and they've clarified a number of things like having to do with quantification, having to do with essence and necessitation, that were kind of very quickly treated in some of my stuff. So I would definitely like to modify some of that. But one thing that I don't want to modify is that I think that the recent literature has not really come to grips still with the complexity of real world kinds. And these complexities pose obstacles to, I think, any kind of unified reductive formulation to answer these sorts of questions. So while I think that the project is a very important project, and that there are some interesting directions and lessons to learn, nonetheless, the kind of unified reductive project that's indicated by the approach that these people is taking, I think, needs to be corrected. Thank you very much.